Hello, this is Professor Hasselman in History 104 Online, and today we're going to be talking about ancient Greece. And this lecture will be split into 5 different groups, and I'll put these different lecture titles up on the screen so you to take a look at. So once again, this is History 104 Online with Professor Hasselman. Now, in today's lecture, we're going to be talking about ancient Greece. Now, civilization in the Greek world began on the Mediterranean island Crete about 2000 BCE. The civilization there has long been called the Minoan, from the mythical king Minos. Now, we do not yet know exactly who these people were, and examples of their writing have been discovered, but the language is unknown, but it is not Greek. Now, the massive palace complex at Knossos, which covers about 5 acres and has a central courtyard that is 55 meters by 25 meters, provides clues about the Minoans. The size, beauty, and decorations of the complex suggest wealth, leisure, and a developed aesthetic sense. Storehouses and linear A documents suggest bureaucracy, artistic motifs, and perhaps architectural forms suggest contacts with the Near East and Egypt. Now, the complete lack of fortification suggests that the people were peaceful and non-aggressive. Now, Minoan civilization flourished from 1800 to 1550 BCE. In 1626 BCE, a volcanic eruption on Thera, about 70 miles away, caused heavy damage and may have initiated the decline of the Minoans. Much of the island was devastated by conquest around 1550 BCE, and the conquerors almost certainly came from the mainland Greece. Civilization took hold slowly in Greece. A little bit about Greece in this area. The land in the mainland Greece is rocky, the soil poor, and the climate, especially in the north, very harsh. Now, by 6500 BCE, villages showed signs of the Neolithic Revolution. And around 3000, and again around 2300 BCE, or to some around 1700, the Balkans saw impressive migrations. By 2600 to 2200 BCE, we see the first signs of urban development and the Mediterranean triad of crops: cereal grains, grapes, and olives. Now, from about 2000 BCE, we can discern Mycenaean civilization, named for the great citadel at Mycenae. Now, almost certainly, the Mycenaeans conquered the Minoans. Now, apparently, they had been learning from and grew jealous of the Minoans. The high point of Mycenaean civilization was from 1400 to 1200 BCE. Now, the sources of our knowledge of the Mycenaean are 3: linear B documents, archaeology, and Homeric poems. Linear B documents were found in profusion. These were deciphered by Michael Ventris and others in the early 1950s, and they revealed a world of bureaucratic regulation. Archaeology, if we look at that, impressive remains have been found at several major sites such as Mycenae, Sparta, Pylos, Corinth, and so on. Large fortified sites with strong defensive works and imposing royal residences suggest strong kingship and military rule. Tomb complexes suggest historical memory and dynastic continuity. Now, Homeric poems, especially the Iliad, are the most important sources, but also difficult and controversial. The Homeric poems were put into something like their current shape after 800 and probably around 725 BCE, then written down about 550 BCE. Now, how can they tell us much about the period from 1400 to 1200? Now, after World War II, Milman Parry and Albert Lord studied poetic bards in Yugoslavia and discovered that they could recite up to 500,000 lines of material. Think of Alex Haley and the Roots, or of perhaps today with scripts and lyrics. Therefore, it's legitimate to think that much authentic material was transmitted over a long time by Homer. Now, the Mycenaean elements in this story are the basic and concrete details, names of key places and perhaps people, some aspects of warfare in the old days, a vague sense of the diplomatic structure of the time. Now, the Trojan War, the traditional date about 1194 BCE, was probably a trade dispute and may have been a Mycenaean inheritance from the Minoans. The ethical teachings of the Iliad relate more precisely to the period when the poems were put into coherent form, which is our next subject. Now, we're going to talk now about the Dark Age in archaic Greece. Now, Greek civilization did not grow to glory in a straight line from the Mycenaeans. Now, between 1200 and 1100 BCE, there is evidence of widespread destruction of the major Mycenaean sites, some of which, not least Mycenae itself, were never re-inhabited. Now, these invasions were gradually or traditionally associated with the Dorians, a people from northern Greece who pushed south and settled primarily in the Peloponnesus with Sparta as their key city. But the Dorians were not alone in disrupting Mycenaean Greece. They were alone in being remembered. Now, introducing the Dorians provides an opportunity to clarify some terms. Now, we speak of Greeks oddly because the Romans called them Graeci. The Greeks called themselves Hellenists, and their land Hellas, or Hellas. There were four major groupings of Greeks with modest ethnic and linguistic differences: Attic, Ionic, Aeolic, and Doric. The Dorian invasions ushered in a period of traditionally we call the Dark Ages. This was a time of small, illiterate communities. And the Greeks forgot how to write. This period also saw depopulation, deurbanization, and scant construction. Now, between about 800 and 700 BC, the Greek world began to show signs of life and energy. Historians speak of the transition to the Archaic period, about 750 to 550. The Greek achievement of this period was the polis, or the city-state. That was the key Greek political institution, which we'll talk about more later. We'll take a detailed look at this in the next section. For now, we'll look at origins. Dark Age Greece was relatively peaceful, and after about 900, the population began to grow. Now, this gradually produced fierce competition for resources in the poor land. Also around 900 or 800 BCE, the commercial exploits of the Phoenicians, which we mentioned in the previous lecture, were a spur to at least some Greeks. Wealth generated by trade also upset the delicate balance in modest agricultural communities. And beginning in around 750 BCE, various Greek cities displayed one or more of three responses to the tensions of the age: conquest, trade, or colonization. Sparta conquered and enslaved their neighbors to the west. Athens, but also Corinth and other cities, entered into widespread commercial ventures, and the Athenians and others may have been emulating the Phoenician example. And Corinth, above all, along with many other Greek cities, exported surplus population to colonies that maintained emotional, political, and economic relations with their mother cities, literally metropolis. Now, of these processes, the commercial, and especially the colonial, were of immense historical significance. Greek cities, language, culture, art, architecture, literature, and political institutions were scattered all over the Mediterranean world. But the Greeks learned too. For example, they got their alphabet from the Phoenicians. The later Dark Ages and the Archaic period give evidence for the emergence of some of Greek culture, some familiar aspects of Greek culture. Decorations on pottery are revealing. Geometric designs show rationalism, but also a sense of order, balance, and harmony. Let me fix this slide right here. Where was I? Figured pottery shows a tendency to abstraction, an attempt to discern behind what is visible to what is really more true. And aesthetic taste and technical virtuosity are also on display. Sculpture also shows a steady progression that may have owed much to Egyptian styles, but that also advanced the Greek quest to explore the particularities of the human condition. A return to Homer's poems also opens up a vista for the values and ideologies of the age and hints at some of the age's changes. Now, intense competition, both verbal and physical, is portrayed in the poems. Compare the athletic contests. The poems evidence reflections on brains, Nestor, versus brawn, Achilles. The poem addresses respective obligations of the individual and the community, and they examine the nature of authority, kings and great advisors versus the ordinary man. We also see changes in warfare in Homer's poems, from the single combat of the heroes to the hoplite phalanx, featuring the ordinary soldier. This formative period then brought into view, albeit in embryonic form, many of the features of Greece's classical period. Now, the classical polis, which is we're going to talk about, we're going to have two little sections here, one on Sparta and one on Athens. The classical polis, or plural polis, was a political structure, political, social, and cultural entity. Oops, I jumped ahead here. There you go. Political, social, and cultural entity. Over the next couple lectures, we'll look at it from each of these points of view. First, we address some preliminary considerations. The physical characteristics of a polis may be expressed by a formula. Astai plus chora equals polis. Astai is the Greek word for the city proper, the core of the polis. Chora means the region or district in our formula. It refers to the agricultural hinterland around a polis. A polis, therefore, is always an urban core and a rural zone. Athens plus Attica equals the Athenian polis. Sparta plus Laconia equals the Spartan polis. The urban area usually had an agora, or a market area, temples, a building, or area where public decisions were reached, and entertainment facilities such as theaters and stadiums. Some polis had natural fortifications, or an acropolis. Aristotle believed that people naturally lived in polis. He and his pupils studied more than 100 Greek polis, and the amount of variation from one to another could be considerable, and we shall look in detail at only two. Sparta's early development is shrouded in legend. Supposedly, Lycurgus, a mythical lawgiver on the command of the gods, gave Sparta a constitution all at once around 750 BCE. In fact, the Spartan system emerged piecemeal after the conquest of the Messenians around 725 BCE. One outstanding feature of the Spartan system was the social classes. The homoioi, or equals, were adult male Spartan citizens over the age of 18. They had substantial rights of political participation, which was unusual at an early date. The periokoi, or dwellers about, were what we would call resident aliens. These people were not citizens, but enjoyed basic protection. There are many theories about just who they were. The helots, or state slaves, were essentially the conquered Messenians. The helots belonged to Sparta and not to individual Spartans. Now, there were two kings drawn from the same two families who had veto power over each other. One was usually at home, and one away with the army. And there were 2 deliberate councils. All equals belonged to the assembly. This body could propose laws, wars, or treaties, but could not legislate by itself. Real power was vested in a council consisting of the kings, the ephors, who we will discuss in a moment, and equals over the age of 60. This body could ignore or act on suggestions from the assembly of equals. There were 5 ephors, or overseers, whose job it was to ensure that any law passed by the council or any verdict passed by the court was in accordance with Spartan tradition. They were always old and wealthy equals. The Crypteia, or secret police, were young men between the ages of 18 and 20 who primarily spied on the helots, but also snooped on ordinary equals. The Spartan constitution depended on the social system, the agoge, or the training or upbringing. Babies were inspected at birth, and the healthy ones were returned to their parents until age 7. At age 7, boys were enrolled in military brotherhoods to which they belonged the rest of their lives. From 7 to 18, they underwent rigorous physical and military training, and from 18 to 20, many served in the Secret Service, then entered a regular army unit until age 60. Marriage was not companionate. Its sole function was the production of more equals. The system aimed to create military excellence, discipline, and loyalty. Spartan life was austere and simple. Spartans believed that book learning made them effeminate. Spartans used iron and money to make hoarding unattractive. Now, the Spartan system aimed to hold the helots in check. Their labor made the life of the equals possible, and to ward off any threat of attack. By about 550, Sparta had formed the Peloponnesian League, which gave it the opportunity to control the constitutions of member states. Sparta tried to prevent democracies and social turmoil, and the Spartan system was still in place when Rome conquered Greece in the 2nd century BCE. But there were a few equals left by then. Contemporaries admired Sparta's strength, simplicity, and stability. Now let's take a look at the Greek polis. Now, the story of Athens is the gradual shift of political power from the Eupatrids, or the well-fathered ones, to the demos, or the people. So Eupatrids from the well-fathered ones to the people. Now, with the luxury of hindsight, we can see an orderly process that has almost an air of inevitability. That process also seems natural to us because we suppose that others would share our admiration for democracy, that is, the rule, or kriteia, by the people. But ancient writers disliked democracy in general, and the democracy of Athens in particular. Athens created democracy accidentally, as the city's leaders responded to one crisis after another. Now, in the 7th century BCE, most of the Greek world, except Athens and Sparta, experienced tyranny. This was the rule by a strong man, who set himself up as the leader of the people. Popular discontent, as we have seen, arose from economic and demographic stresses as the beginning of the Archaic period. We've seen how Sparta escaped tyranny. Now we turn to Athens. Around 621 BCE, Draco codified the laws of Athens and posted them in the Athenian agora. The code was harsh, or draconian, but it represented a concession to those who opposed the arbitrary rule of the Eupatrids. Athens was in principle now ruled by laws, not by men. Now, ordinary Athenian farmers still suffered cycles of boom and bust, and the city was home to more and more rich merchants who had no place in society, dominated by wealthy, land-owning Eupatrids. In 594, Solon, a Eupatrid who had made a fortune in trade, was appointed lawgiver with wide authority to introduce reforms. Solon was a moderate without personal ambition. He abolished many debts and debt slavery. He changed the basic qualifications for office holding from birth to wealth, and distributed offices and the right to vote quite widely according to a sliding scale of wealth. He also created a council of 400 that set the agenda for the assembly of all citizens, and this is just the opposite of Sparta's system. The next generation saw squabbling among many who felt that Solon had not gone far enough, for some who felt he had not gone far enough. The lowest classes elevated Pisistratus to a mild tyranny in 560. He and his sons dominated Athens for about 40 years. He respected most of Solon's system, but did redistribute land. Pisistratus also inaugurated festivals and initiated people or public building projects, partly to make people loyal to and proud of Athens, and partly to cut them or put them to work. Eventually, the Athenian Eupatrids allied themselves with some Eupatrids and drove out Pisistratus. A blue blood named Cleisthenes was given powers to make reforms. Now, from Cleisthenes to Pericles, Athenian democracy came into full force. Because Cleisthenes was disappointed with the Eupatrids, he turned to the Demos, and he created a new council of 500 based on resistance, not birth or tradition, or residence, not birth or tradition. He bound together people of different social and occupational backgrounds. He opened almost all offices to almost all men, and he introduced ostracism. Themistocles was a popular leader during the Persian Wars. Because many of Athens' sailors were still denied some political rights, he worked to remedy the situation. Now, between 461 and 450, Ephialtes, and Pericles ended all aristocratic privilege by stripping the Eupatrid Areopagus of the right of judicial review, and by instituting pay for public service. Now, let's take a little time to reflect on this Athenian system. So those are all the great leaders that slowly introduced new rights and new voting rights for different groups of people. Now, how did it work? So how did the system work? The Athenian system encompassed a weak executive, powerful role for the assembly, that is, for participation of ordinary people, and vigorous debate. There was danger of demagogues, or those who were able to speak louder than others, and there was also no necessary continuity in policy, because things could be switched back and forth very easily. Now, for whom did it work? Now, today when we think of democracy, we think everyone is equal. But for the Athenian citizens, that is, adult males with 2 Athenian parents, perhaps about 10% of the 400,000 people in the city. So a very small number of people. It didn't work for women, or metics, resident aliens, or slaves who were increasingly numerous. How was it financed? Well, by tribute from the Athenian Empire, and also by slave labor. Who defended it? Pericles, especially in his funeral oration. Who criticized it? Well, almost all ancient writers did. Plato and Aristotle believed that it did not advance the best of men. The old oligarch believed it lacked deference and was too unstable, changeable, and subject to demagoguery. Now, the historian Thucydides gave examples of folly, cruelty, and perversity. Now, what was the verdict? Well, the Athenians demonstrated what a democracy might be. It remained for others to show for whom a democracy might work. So when we look back at ancient Greece during this time period, especially in Athens, which was really only the few places where this new democratic system developed, it's very different from the democratic system that we think of today. So really, it wasn't as democratic as we may think. All right, our final section of today's discussion is on the civic culture, especially between architecture and drama. So we're going to begin with the most public of cultural manifestations, the most public of art forms. And in Athens, this means architecture and drama. Now, no art form is so public and commercial as architecture, and we know that at least some temples already existed by about 725 BC. Now, because Homer mentions them. Now, in the Dark Ages and Archaic period, Greeks no longer built palaces as in the Mycenaean period. Architecture was increasingly civic. Colonies usually built buildings that mirrored the ones of the metropolis. Pisistratus, as already noted, initiated a building program in Athens. And in the Persian Wars between 490 and 478 BCE, Athens was sacked and burned, and her public buildings were left in ruins. The restoration of peace and the revenues from the imperial tribute permitted rebuilding on a grand scale. Now, we may take the Parthenon in Athens as the finest example of a Greek building, and as an example that teaches us a great deal about the people who built it. The Parthenon was built between 447 or 446 and 438 BCE, with its sculptures finished in 432. The chief architects were Ictinus and Callicrates, and the main sculptor was Pheidias. Now, to appreciate the Parthenon, let's consider the basic elements of a Greek building. The key elements of a floor plan were stylobate with colonnade or peristyle, interior chambers, and passageways. The key vertical elements were stereobate and stylobate, column, shaft and capital, entablature, and also note too the Doric and Ionic orders. These were the most common in ancient Greece. The Greek knew the Corinthian with its acanthus leaf capitals, but it was the Romans who popularized this order. So these are two different ways that they designed columns, a Doric and Ionic. And basically the difference was what you see at the top and bottom of the columns. Now, the building was in almost perfect condition until 1687 when a Venetian shell hit it. Now, fortunately, there were 1674 drawings of the sculptures in situ. Many of the best sculptures, the Elgin marbles, are in the British Museum, and and also a bone of contention. The building is more than 100 feet long, with 8 columns across. The front, instead of the usual 6, and 17 columns on each side instead of the usual 12 to 15. The floors all curve outward to the corners. The columns lean in slightly, and the building is huge but elegant and graceful. Now, the Parthenon has 3 great sculptural programs. Pediments, or triangular inns, show the birth of Athena and the battle between Athena and Poseidon for control of Athens. Metopes have scenes of battle, both historical, Greek and Trojan, and mythical, Lapiths and centaurs, Greeks and Amazons, and the continuous frieze about the Sella depicts probably aspects of the Panathenaic festivals. Now, the building was meant to make several points to and about Athenians. Its immense size was meant to be impressive. The cost of the building was to make Athenians proud and to make them accept the empire. The historical, including the mythical sculptures, put Athens' long and proud history on display for all to see, embrace, and cherish. The unusual secular scene of the Panathenaea held up a mirror to the Athenians themselves. Now, really quickly, we're going to watch a little video here, a Khan Academy video, talking about the design of the friezes from I believe this is from the British Museum. So we'll go ahead and watch this really quick.
We're in the British Museum, and we're looking at the frieze that went around the Parthenon.
Not exactly on the exterior of the Parthenon.
Inside the porch, basically. They're carved quite shallow, and although they would have been painted more brightly, I still think it would have been a little tough to see.
Essentially, what we have is a procession of the citizens of Athens on the birthday of Athena, patron goddess of Athens.
And it would wind its way through the city until it actually reached her temple.
Right, the Parthenon, and inside the Parthenon was a giant sculpture by Phidias of the goddess Athena.
What we have here then is actually not a representation of some mythology, but actually a representation of something that the Athenians would have lived themselves.
Yes, and they're putting themselves in the realm of the gods because they take part in the procession, looking very ideal and very noble, and the procession ends with a sacrifice to the gods in the presence of the gods and goddesses. And so, in a way, the human realm and the divine realm,
that definition dissolves.
Right.
Let's take a close look at the procession,
Okay.
because first of all, it's extremely long. It was on two sides of the building. The procession actually starts off kind of slowly here.
right, and it gathers momentum and energy. And we're talking about dozens of horses, dozens of riders, each one depicted slightly differently. Horses overlapping riders.
There's an incredible sense of rhythm and actually movement. I mean, all of this is frozen. It's stone, right? Nothing's moving. But there's such a complexity of the hooves of the horses, of the legs of the horses, of the legs of the
anatomy
riders.
of the horses,
Oh, it's incredible.
the muscles, their veins.
And each one is in a slight, as you said, is in a slightly different position, but all creating this momentum. And to my ear, I almost hear the footfalls of those horses.
The male figures have these wide shoulders and narrow hips and beautiful torsos, incredible muscles in their arms, but these very beautiful faces that are very calm.
We see those humans, these Athenians, actually controlling the power and the wildness of nature represented through the horses.
And there's something really wonderful about an animal that's acting very wild and passionate, and a human rider just sitting, holding it so nobly, maybe turning and looking back behind him, not even worried about that animal that's about to rear up, but in such control that he can even turn his back on it. There's something about that that speaks to a kind of nobility and heroism.
So if in fact the frieze depicts the Panathenaic procession, and that's generally accepted, although there are some art historians that have suggested alternate possibilities, then most likely what we're seeing is the folding of the peplos here, which was actually woven by the Athenians. It was a great honor, and of course it was ultimately paraded through the city to drape the statue of the goddess Athena herself in the temple of the Parthenon. This group of relief sculptures would have been directly over the main entrance to the Parthenon. You know, the Parthenon itself could actually be surmounted from any direction, but in order to walk into the main chamber, you would have walked directly under this, and
you would have looked up at the gods. These are in less good condition, and there's a kind of stillness here and more of an isolation to the figures than these rough and tumble of the horses and the riders and the procession that I love so much. But what's really remarkable in these figures is the treatment of the drapery. It's almost like there was a sculptor who, under Phidias's direction, just loved playing with the patterns of the drapery. They swirl and move and gather. I mean, we're looking at three figures here who sit facing each other, but one turns away. And there's one figure here who just, I've never seen anything. Is that who it is?
Yes.
It's so human and so divine at the same time. And even though we can't see his face, there's a kind of total confidence and idealism to his body, and the way he holds his body and the way he moves, and he lifts up his knee and leans back and looks on and has a sense of total tranquility. And yet his gesture is so human.
there's a kind of complete comfort within his own body that the sculptor is able to express just exquisitely.
It's remarkable for its variety, for its complexity, for its unity.
For its understanding of the variety of human experience, of motion, of the relationship between animal and man and God, and very much in that way is a mirror of the way that the Greeks saw themselves in the world.
All right. Now, in Athens, the other great public art was drama, performed in impressive open-air theaters. Citizens got free tickets, and the origins of the word tragedy, which means goat song, are remote and go back to wild celebrations in honor of Dionysus, called Bacchus by the Romans. Think of the Bacchanal. Now, in tradition, Thespis, hence the term thespian, performed the first dramatic tragedy in Athens in around 530 BCE. The oldest surviving play dates from about 470. Now, we know the titles of more than 100 plays, but fewer than 24 survive intact, and all are by 3 playwrights: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. For Aristotle, whose Poetics is the world's first work of literary criticism, tragedy was a kind of poetry that was serious, written in beautiful language, dramatic, not narrative in form, arousing fear and pity that purify the emotions. Now, in sum, a tragedy is an elegant story of an admirable person struggling nobly against insuperable odds. Aeschylus wrote trilogies, one of which, the Oresteia, survives. It's an account of the fall of the house of Agamemnon and becomes a parable for the origins of justice. The trilogy was performed in 458, just when the Areopagus was stripped of its last powers in Athens. Aeschylus also wrote The Persians, the only play about a contemporary theme. Sophocles abandoned the trilogy. His plays explored justice in principle and the consequences of right action, especially seen in Antigone, and of just punishments for unintentional acts, as seen in his Oedipus Rex. He reflected and participated in the deep philosophical debates of his day. Euripides was unconventional in all ways. He adapted dramatic forms, for example, choruses were less important, and looked at the power of emotions, love, jealousy, and revenge. His plays show the disillusionment of Athens as the Peloponnesian War dragged to a sorry end. Now, not all drama was tragic. There was also comedy. Tragedy was set in the remote past amongst mythical characters, even though it often commented on pointed ways on current events. Comedy was set in the present and satirized, sometimes even ridiculed, prominent contemporaries. Comedy could be vulgar, but it still had a certain elegance and grace. The most famous ancient comedian, and the only one whose plays survives, is Aristophanes. Lysistrata is a famous anti-war play. In it, the women of Athens stage a sex strike to end the war. And in fact, there are serious themes and social commentary running through the play. Clouds, also by Aristophanes, pokes fun at currently popular philosophers and scoops up Socrates unfairly into the criticism. Now, public arts then provide us with 3 insights: the pride of the Athens, the technical mastery of Athenian craftsmen, and the remarkably open way in which the ideas are aired. Okay, this is the end of our lecture on the beginnings of ancient Greece. When we have the next lecture next time, we're going to be discussing a little further about ancient Greece and bring us up to the end of the Greek rule and the beginning of Roman rule.